everyone, and welcome to the Apex. When it comes to cars, the phrase race on Sunday, sell on Monday is never far behind. And there's probably nobody in the vintage, classic and competition car market who embodies it more fully than our guest this week, Gregor Fisken of Fiskens Fine Historic Automobiles. Some of the world's greatest cars have passed over the cobbles of Gregor's premises in London's Queensgate Place Mews, where he and his team, in their words, separate fact from fiction and the best from the merely adequate. But that's not all. When he can spare a moment, Gregor is also a bona fide racing driver with multiple Le Mans appearances to his name, including time as a works driver for Courage in the LMP1 class and racing a factory-backed Larbre-run Aston Martin DBR9 in the road-based GT1 category. He really has done it all, and we're thrilled to have him on the show. Gregor, welcome to the Apex.
Oh, thank you, Hector. That was quite an introduction. Thank you.
we do our best. So, to begin with, could you tell us a bit about your early days in the motoring business and how did you start out in the world of cars?
Well, I've got to give immense credit to my mother and father. Both mum and dad were great car enthusiasts. And my father, when he left the army and married mum, set up a little petrol station, a little country garage in a place called Kingsmuir up in Angus in Scotland. Mum had been introduced to lovely cars by my grandfather. My grandfather was a great car enthusiast, and he had Ferraris and he had Mercedes and all sorts of lovely cars. And was a real, I suppose, a real petrol head. I mean, he loved his motoring, and that passed on to mum. Dad had a great love of cars, and what they did in their little petrol station was beyond selling what they call bread and butter cars, they get lovely exotic cars for friends, and they travel down to London and they bring up the odd Ferrari and the odd Triumph Stag and the Jensens and Aston Martins. So when I was a kid, it was always wonderful when Dad returned from the south with some automotive piece of joy. And we always had lovely old cars around us. And in those days, collecting cars, it was all about vintage and veteran cars or cars from the 1930s. And up in Scotland, there was a great community of guys who were passionate for vintage Bentley, were passionate for Elvis, and indeed some of the other exotic marks, Bugatti, De La Haye's, and things like that. There was always a group of enthusiasts that we would meet. We'd go to car shows, and that's really how that's what started it.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And I read somewhere that the respected restorer Bunty Scott Moncrief took you under his wing at an early stage. Could you tell us a bit more about him and what he taught you, what influence he had on you?
Well, it was my great good fortune to be taken under Bunty's wing. I mean, I was something of a failed schoolboy, and I got myself into a lot of trouble at school. I was lucky with my housemaster because my housemaster loved cars, but I was no academic. I loved music and I loved drinking and smoking. And I got and the combination, and my love of drinking, smoking, and music didn't sit well with the school curriculum. But my love of cars sat very well with my housemaster, and I should have been expelled, ages before the final time came. And my housemaster, lovely man called John Arkell, said to my parents, "Look, there's just no point, Gregor, carrying on at school." So I went home. I think I was 15 and a bit, or just under 16, and I started working in my mum and dad's workshop, and I was working on commercial vehicles, and that was great. I mean, I'm no great mechanic, but I loved getting involved. I loved taking things apart and seeing how things work. And there was a memorable lunch where this wonderful man, Bunty Scott Moncrief, who was an absolute legend. He'd written books on vintage and veteran cars. He was, famed his kind of handle on his adverts back in the 1960s and 70s. He was a purveyor of horseless carriages to the nobility and gentry since 1927. And I'd read his books. Wow. And when I met him, we got on really famously. And he used to come up to Scotland a fair bit. And he had on his wife's side of the family, they had an old stately home about 3 miles from where we lived, and his son Humphrey was still in the classic car business, and my dad would often find old Bentleys and Rolls Royces from some of the Scottish sporting estates which had been delivered to Scotland new, and Dad would sort of channel them to Humphrey, and Humphrey would bring them south. But through Humphrey we met Bunty, and Bunty sort of was told over lunch the trouble I got in at school, and he said, "Well, send the dear boy down south to me." So we'll look after him. So I was packed off to work in the workshops of David Scott Moncrief and Son in Leek in Staffordshire. And I was put up and lived with Bunty and his wonderful wife Avril Scott Moncrief, who lived in a lovely cottage which was part of an old folly below Avril's family stately home, which was Basford Hall, and we lived in this lovely little cottage. My rent was a bottle of gin a week. My bed wasn't long enough for me. It was apparently Napoleon's traveling cot. So I used to wear hairy kilt socks on my feet because they stuck out at the end of the bed. But I absolutely loved it, and it was a bit of an induction of fire for me, because I was a sports little public school boy, and I had to roll up my sleeves and work as an apprentice mechanic in the workshops in Leek. But the mechanics there were really great guys, and they sort of took me under their wing and used to have a lot of fun at my expense. But the workshop was filled with fabulous cars. I mean, really fabulous cars. And I was just, pig and poo. It was fantastic. And, it was, the stories that I learned from Bunty and Avril at night, it was an education by night and it was an education by day. And it changed my life forever.
That's fantastic. It almost sounds like, classic and vintage cars by Charles Dickens, but that's
Absolutely.
Brilliant. So,
Absolutely.
Coming on to the modern business, Fiskens has always had extremely impressive and rare stock. So I wanted to ask, what makes for a good consignment? What do you look for in cars you take on?
I mean, we've got a bit of a handle, which we say Fiskens, where the world's greatest cars come to be sold. And what defines greatness? It's not necessarily price. It's the best of breed. If you're talking about a Ferrari or a Jaguar or a Bentley or a Bugatti or an Alfa, it really is. It's the car. I suppose the Holy Grail is the car with the most interesting history, in the highest state of originality, our market can be quite nuanced. And I suppose that with different marks, you look for slightly different things. With a race car, of course, it can all be about racing success and history.
Yeah. But
of course, some of the cars with the greatest racing histories have had the hardest lives, so they don't end up being the most original.
Absolutely.
I suppose there's the car that did very little racing and got put away and got hardly used. But there are certain cars which did have great racing histories, and they had, they never had bad days or terrible days in their lives where if they got bashed, they got repaired in period. But they retain the key elements of originality, and they and with wonderful patina as well. But it is, it does change, and it is quite nuanced dependent upon the mark and the type. With a road car, with some fantastic Bugatti Type 55, which for example you wouldn't expect to race. If you can find that car that's been an epic long-term ownership, been owned by a loving collector, an enthusiast for half a century or more. When that type of car comes towards us, that's really exciting. Where something's been really cherished, hasn't been on the market forever, publicly. That for us is an exciting consignment.
That's interesting. And aside from dealing in cars, I mean, you frequently race them as well. And I've got a list here. I mean, you've raced everything truly vintage racing cars to right bang up to date modern equipment. How does that inform your work? Does it give you special insights that you can share with clients who maybe, have never been on a track before, but are still looking to purchase a racing car?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, someone said to me, Gregor, you must be an amazing salesman. I'm really not a salesman. I've never ever sold a car to anyone in my life. What I am is by saying someone's a good salesman, there's an impression that you're persuading someone to do something they might not want to have done.
Yeah.
What happens, and back to your question, is by racing the cars and being involved with the cars, the cars make an impression on you. And if you're an enthusiast, you get excited. And when I race, if I just step down of having driven a Maserati 250F or having driven some wonderful Silver Ghost on the road or a 4.5 litre Bentley, or just having got out of a car, if I then talk to someone about that car, I just talk about the car. I speak for the car. And at the end of that conversation, someone says, do you know what? That's fantastic. Can I have it, please? Wonderful. It's no more complicated than that. It's when we get cars here at Fiskens, for the younger people who work in the business, the first thing I say to them, I say, get in the car and take it for a drive. Go and see what it's like, because for me, these are not things you can look at academically. We are in a privileged position here where these amazing cars come here, and until you've driven them, until you've experienced them, you can't speak for the car. And it's amazing when on the rare occasions when things go quiet here. I go, well, let's take them all out and let's go for a drive. Let's go and just get the car out. As soon as the cars come alive, we come alive. And I'd hate to have a job where I had to sell something, I had to speak for something I didn't believe in or didn't have a passion for. So yeah, that's why driving them is what it's all about.
That makes absolute sense. Just further on the racing, you seem to be a fan of endurance racing yourself in particular. And again, you've raced everything from BMW M3s, Porsche GT3s to prototypes at Le Mans, Sebring, Spa, Nürburgring. What do you like about that form of racing? And maybe could you tell us about some of your standout endurance racing memories or experiences?
I think the reason I like, again, it comes back to a little bit of a childhood thing. When I was 15, my little brother Dougal was, 13. We went to Le Mans for the first time, and we went on a vintage Bentley trip to Le Mans. I think it was about 1978 to celebrate one of the Bentley trips there, and they allowed us in the Bentleys to do a few laps on the track. And I remember my dad was driving. We'd driven all the way down from Scotland in a Speed 6 Bentley in the back of it, which was quite an experience. And half of it spent under the tonneau. But I remember Dad, Mum was up front with Dad, and I remember we kind of left the pits, and my brother and I were in the back. And it was just fantastic. There were all these kind of genuine team cars in front of us, and everyone was really buzzed up. And I remember leaving the pits, and we got to Tête Rouge, which is those fabulous line of trees just as you go onto the Mulsanne Straight. And I'd seen all the pictures, and I'd read, Tim Birken's, biography. And I remember as the car was coming onto Tête Rouge, onto the Mulsanne, my mum was shouting at my father, "Ian, slow down." And my brother Dougal and I was sort of shouting at Dad, going, go on, Dad, because I think someone had tried to take us on the inside. And I remember, like a kid, as we went down the Mulsanne Straight, something just hit me in my veins. I was like, I'm going to race here. Yeah. I am going to, this is it. There's nothing else more important to me. And of course, I had that kind of kiddie dream of I wanted to be Birken or Bonata or kids. I wanted to race a vintage Bentley at Le Mans. So I think that's kind of what started it. So then it was all about Le Mans. And then, of course, the more I studied, then I got into reading about, the great Jaguar wins at Le Mans, and Ferrari in the 60s, the Ford versus Ferrari battle. Then, I kind of started reading about Derek Bell and Jackie Eakes, and it was always amazing. But through all of that, whilst I read about these heroes, there was a kind of little kind of thing that went through all these stories, and there was always a gentleman driver who drove at Le Mans, either with a professional. And I guess I cottoned onto the idea that I don't think I could blag my way into a Formula One career, but I wondered, it seemed to me that it was possible as an amateur to get yourself to Le Mans. And that, I guess I sort of that was my dream and that was my target, but I didn't have the means or the wherewithal or the contacts to get there. And then sort of circumstances came that, that friends of mine were racing BMWs and racing Caterhams, and and I'd always wanted to go to the Nürburgring and race on the Nordschleife. And I started doing these 24-hour races on the Nordschleife and 24-hour races at Spa. And once I did my first kind of long distance race, that was it for me.
Yeah, there's just something about it, isn't there? So
yeah, and I think there's also it's not about just one person. It's about a team. It's about making it to the end. It's also I think in the beginning, particularly when I did the BMW racing, there was an almost Iron Man kind of thing about it. I mean, some of the stints we do in the cars would be, you do 2 and a bit hours and then another hour and a bit or whatever. I mean, they were massive long stints. There was something really quite appealing about that, lap after lap after lap. I think I have I have a huge appreciation for Grand Prix racing, but Grand Prix racing can never give you sunset. Grand
absolutely.
Prix racing, when you're at Le Mans and you got through the night, and dawn, and you're going down towards Indianapolis at 200 miles an hour, and the sun's just starting to come up, and you start to pick out the trees. There's that kind of sense of, wow, we're through the night. I think we can make it, and that I think there's things like that which are special to endurance racing.
Wow, yeah, no, you took me away there. And just on the cars themselves, because I know that you've raced things like the Aston Martin DBR9, the Jaguar D-Type, the Maserati 200S, amongst many others. What were your standouts from those cars, and how does that sort of car compare to the more modern racing machinery that you've raced? Because I know that a lot of our listeners, well, frankly, have driven neither, but would love to know.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that if you were to sort of make a difference between the older cars and the modern cars, I think the older cars they're a little bit more about car control. And I think, modern cars, I mean, if you're driving a car on slicks and you start to slide a car on slicks, you're generally in a position where, you're correcting something which can turn into an accident. Where you're racing the old cars, it's all about the four-wheel drift. It's an awful lot about car control. And I just love that. The old cars, something like the DBR9 Aston or a Maserati 250F, those cars, you just have these beautiful four-wheel drifts out of them. And I mean, one of the finest experience I had was a client very kindly lent me a Ferrari 250 GTO to race years and years ago. And I remember that car was just like a kind of, it reminded me of when I was back up in Scotland, I used to do some special stage rallying and I drove Ford Escorts and Toyota Corollas and Celicas and things like that. And I remember those cars, if you were on the loose surface, you could just about back them into a corner where you turn in and you'd almost be looking out the rear screen. And I remember the Ferrari 250 GTO was like that. I mean, you could slide it it would send you a little letter saying, okay, we're sliding. And then it would send you another letter going, I'm sliding some more. And you drove it on the steering wheel, but you also drove it on your right foot. I mean, a lot of the drift was controlled by your right foot. And I remember the angles you could get this GTO at were shut. And you just think, I'm going to spin it. I'm going to spin it. And you just didn't spin it. It was just awesome. And I think old cars, really give you that. The modern stuff, it is all about grip. And then what you're doing is, you're in particular cars like some of the prototypes, or even the DBR9 that I raced for Larbre. The DBR9 had a reasonable amount of downforce, which meant the faster you went, the more grip the car generated because of the load that was being pushed by the front splitter on the front and the rear wing on the rear. And it was just incredible how, you could use that to brake unbelievably late. But also you could use that, in the high speed corners where, with the faster you went, you almost had, the sense of having an elephant on the front and an elephant on the back of the car. But that takes a degree of belief in the kind of the aero, so you're sort of you're putting your faith and trust into aerodynamics. So yeah, they're very different. They're very different, but you're still driving, and there's still limits, and it's all about getting up to the limit and being as fast as possible.
Yeah, I love the sound of those two philosophies. So let's maybe talk about your personal car collection. From the little I have read, I know it contains a number of pre-war cars. There's a Bentley 4.5 litre, there's a Vauxhall 3098, I believe. Could you tell us a bit about your own personal taste in cars and what it is about the ones that you do own that interested you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think that whilst I'm lucky enough to have kept a few nice old cars along the way myself. I've always lived. I've always had kind of champagne dreams, but ginger pop money. So, but because of my wonderful clients and friends, I've lived vicariously through their cars. And some of the greatest cars which I've had the privilege of racing and driving, I never could afford myself. And if I could have afforded them, there's always a flat to buy or children to feed and those sort of things. But one of my mentors was a lovely man called Dan Margulis, and Dan was one of the sort of pioneering motor traders, and Dan was for many years our next door neighbor here in the Mews. And I remember Dan giving me some advice, which was almost contrary to his own experience in life. And he said he regretted not having kept a few nice cars along the way. And I took that to heart. So what I've always tried to do is I've always tried to keep one or two really nice cars. Now, I haven't been able to keep them forever, but along the way, I owned a wonderful Acura Corsa Jaguar C-Type. I owned a Ford France GT40, and all those cars we kept for many years and enjoyed them along the way. But the one car I've never ever been without is a vintage Bentley. And as long as if I was down to my last car, it would be a 4.5 litre Bentley. I mean, I grew up with vintage Bentleys, and I'm a great banger of the drum for the pleasures of pre-war motoring, and it concerns me a little bit that future generations might not get into the vintage cars. But as long as I can draw breath, I urge anyone who hasn't been in a vintage car to get taken out in one, because they blow your mind. People have no idea how good they are, and as a sort of sensory experience, as a tactile thing, as a challenge. I mean, we joke with our clients that in a vintage Bentley, every silent gear change is a victory. They're never boring. I mean, I can take family and friends out driving out in Oxfordshire, and they're having a lovely time as passengers, but I am totally engaged in the process of what I'm driving. And, if you're driving a 3098 Vauxhall or a Type 57 Bugatti, or a 4.5 liter or a 3 liter or a Speed 6, whatever you're driving pre-war, if you're driving well, they're more than capable of keeping up with modern traffic, and they're just completely they are addictively engaging.
Yeah, I've got to say, it's a personal goal of mine. It's a personal goal of mine to take one of those out one day. Maybe coming off what you were just saying there,
we need to make that happen.
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to.
Good, right. We'll get that organized.
So I was just going to say, coming off one of the things you said there about the new generation maybe not being as interested, or at least that's one of your concerns. I wanted to ask on your perspective on the classic car market as a whole at the moment. What are clients asking for? Do you see taste shifting? Do you see a new demographic looking for something new? What's your take on it?
Well, I mean, I think the market, I don't think the expansion of the market, and the market has definitely expanded, is necessarily at the expense of the original cars that made up the classic car market. I think a growing market is very, very healthy. What I've generally tended to see, and I've seen, I think the old car market is a very broad church, and however people get into it doesn't really matter. If people get into it because they come in because they started off collecting a few younger cars, they got into by collecting some modern Ferraris or Porsches, and then got curious about an older car because, say, for example, they came to the Goodwood Festival of Speed. They came as a guest of their modern car supplier, whether it be Aston or Porsche, Ferrari, and they came as a guest, and then they maybe saw something going up the hill and they went, "Oh my God, listen to that. Look at that. Wow, doesn't that smell interesting?" It doesn't really matter as long as people kind of get exposure to it. And I think what we've often seen is, we love cars. There's not a car that I can't find some merit in. But I think what people tend to find is, for example, they come, they buy a relatively new car, they go on a vintage car tour around Europe, or they start doing a track day, and then they realize that there's a kind of limit to what they can do with that, and then they go, well, I wouldn't mind driving at Le Mans Classic, or I really would like to do the Mille Miglia, or I saw, I was driving up the road and I saw these vintage cars, these crazy guys in these pre-war cars doing this Flying Scotsman rally. And I think the events are a big part of it. And I think having cars that are eligible for the events, if you haven't got a suitable car to do a classic car event, then you're going to get curious and you're going to want to buy one. So I think, yes, I see the market expanding. We at Fiskens, we're not all things to all people. There's no point us trying to deal in late model hypercars or things like that, because candidly, they don't do it for me. And they're not things I can have a particular passion for. But and I've listen, the great fun and all the rest of it. But it's interesting on track days that we do. Often people turn up with the kind of, the latest kind of thing, but they all, when we put them into a 1965 E-Type, Goodwood spec E-Type or a Cobra or something like that, they just, when they come in, they smile from ear to ear, because they've actually got to drive the car, they've actually got to feel the car, they've actually got to change gears, and they go, wow, I didn't know sliding could be so much fun.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And when it comes to, well, actually, your day job, there's the quote I used in the introduction on your website. It says, we separate fact from fiction, the best from merely adequate. So we know that the classic car world, it's often, a place where, heritage is contested, cars are fought over, it's discussed constantly on the internet and, in quiet corners of dealerships. How do you do that? How do you do the separating of fact from fiction, the research? What does it look like for something like Fiskens?
I think there's no, I mean, first of all, I think experience. I it's a strange thing and I've seen this all the way through my career. If I was going to go and buy some fine art, if I was going to go and collect impressionist paintings, I would go to the top impressionist painting dealer, and I'd make an arrangement with him. I'd go to the top specialist, the guy who has, perceived to have the best stuff, with a good reputation, and I'd go and make an arrangement, and I would work with that dealer to help me get the good stuff. Yet when it comes to cars, it's a kind of machismo thing where people who have a little bit of knowledge, they go, "Oh, I know about cars. I don't need help." And there's just a lot more to buying the right cars than opening an auction catalog. And talking of auction catalogs, I mean, we get, auction catalogs can be very, very well written. But what they tend to do is they have 2 or 3 pages of tabloid type history about the marque. And then they have one small paragraph on the end, that goes, the car in question is, with limited information. And I think because auctions churn stock all the time, and they're worried about litigation, they don't kind of put they don't get behind it in the way that we do. And because we're deeply into the cars and we've known the cars, and sometimes having been Fiskens, we're coming up to our 30th anniversary. I mean, we've had many of these great cars numerous times, but we also we have enough humility to know that we don't know it all, but we know all the world experts. If it's a Maserati, we know the 2 or 3 people to go and speak to. We take opinions, and I think that there's nothing like, as I said at the beginning of the answer to my answer to your question, is experience. We've seen it all. We know the restorers. We know the historians. We've handled the cars, and we've actually taken the trouble to read the books. Which is another subject. Which the internet is a wonderful thing, but people can put any amount of bollocks up on it.
It's the trade term there.
I mean, I read stuff and I just think, they have no clue. But I also know that, I served a mechanical apprenticeship. I did 2 or 3 years working on the cars. I then did 6 years working, within the trade and industry before anyone would allow me to voice an opinion. And nowadays in a very instant world, people can become, they make I have a guarded relationship with things like Instagram, where we as a company have an Instagram account, and I really see how you can get the message out to an awful lot of people. But I took it off my phone because I just looked at it, and there was so much noise, so much ego. I mean, and it's not. Like everything on the internet, it's unregulated, and it's a very, very addictive medium. But I think there's a lot more to being a specialist in what you sell than making a load of noise on Instagram about something you discovered yesterday.
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive answer, and I think it's probably one that some parts of the car community would certainly do well to listen to. I also read somewhere on your site that one of your kind of guiding principles is that buying and selling old cars should be fun. And I just wanted to ask, what's the most fun you've had negotiating a deal?
Well, I mean, I think coming off my kind of high horse, I think we take the cars seriously, but I don't think we should take ourselves too seriously. And whilst I find and feel, rightly or wrongly, a duty of care to the cars and a duty of care to our customers, it really distresses me when I see, friends of ours who go to an auction, don't even read the catalogue, buy some piece of shit, and then come to us afterwards and seem to be and go, can you help me out of this? And you just go, oh God, why? But I guess because we know our stuff, it's really important that we get the histories of the cars right, and that people know what they're getting, so that and that they come back to us because they were really pleased with what they got. But ultimately, for all of that, because the money is quite serious, you wouldn't go and buy a house without having it properly surveyed or knowing what you buy. But cars are for fun, and I've got my whole life, my friendships, my greatest experiences have been given to me by the cars and the car events and the car people. So, it shouldn't be scary. It shouldn't be risky. And it should be fun. And there's nothing better than seeing someone who you've introduced to an idea of a car or a type of car they've never even thought of, coming back to you going, oh my God, you can't believe the fun we had going on this rally, or you can't believe the fun we had down at Goodwood, and I can't believe it was my dream to do this. And that because, I got this thing through Fiskens, or not even through us, or, it doesn't have to be through us. We just pointed someone in the right direction. So I suppose it's a little bit like being running a successful dating agency. But, but again, and that's another point, there's an awful lot of people end up with cars that they shouldn't end up with. Yep. I think sometimes the hardest thing is to say to someone, do you know what? I don't think that's the right car for you. Yeah, I think, it's the right car, but maybe not quite yet.
I can think of a few friends who fall into that category.
But then again, going back to the fun thing, sometimes, what the best thing you did was just maybe jumping in and getting on with it. But, it should be fun because, ultimately, and, nobody needs classic cars. Nobody has to have classic cars, and classic cars and what they give you should be about fun.
So, Gregor, we're coming up on time now, so I've got 3 quick fire questions for you.
Sure.
To end off with. So, number 1 is, what is your favorite racetrack?
Really difficult to say one. I suppose it would have to be Goodwood, though recently we've been racing a bit at Thruxton, which Thruxton took over from Goodwood when Goodwood closed in '66. Thruxton is a really serious track. Love Spa. Love hate the Nordschleife. I had a huge accident racing at 24 hours at Nürburgring, but the Nordschleife, when driven well, is somewhere amazing. But I, one of my greatest races was at Portland. We run the Portland Grand Prix in LMP2, and I love Portland. I also loved Rockingham. I had lots of success at Rockingham, and sadly, Rockingham's no more. But I think the great tracks. I mean, the Goodwoods, the Spas, Le Mans, of course. That's more than one. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, that'll do. That'll do for us. Question 2 is: what is your favorite driving memory?
There are so many. I remember finishing my first Mille Miglia with a great friend of mine, Bruce Mell. And, I'm no good on watches, stopwatches, all that kind of stuff that you do on the Mille Miglia. But Bruce and I were determined to stay on the route. And his A6 GCS Maserati charging system failed on day one. And I think I changed 8 batteries on it to get to the end. And I remember driving back into Brescia with no lights, with Bruce holding a torch, waggling it round his head so other motorists could see us. I mean, we were just dirty, exhausted, but we were determined to stay on the route. And just finishing that was amazing. I suppose my first Le Mans finish. We went. I went with Lars Erik Nielsen and Ian Donaldson in a Porsche RSR, and the enormity of first of all to finish Le Mans. Forget where you come in a place. To finish Le Mans was 3 amateurs, I guess back to my early schoolboy dream of when I went on the Mulsanne Straight in Dad's Bentley to actually finish Le Mans. That was big.
Wow.
That was big.
And last question. What car from your current stock would you want to take out for a drive right now?
I would like to drive to Donington in our 1912 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, but not touching a motorway. And I'd like to get out the Silver Ghost and get into the McLaren MP4 and do a couple of stints in the MP4. I think that would be my perfect day. And then if someone could swap the Ghost and I could drive the 4.5 litre Bentley coupe back to London in the evening, maybe stopping for dinner on the way, I think that would be a pretty good day.
Gosh, well, that sounds like a fantastic day out. Well, Gregor, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So I'd just like to thank you again for joining us today and for such a brilliantly interesting chat.
Hector, an absolute pleasure, and I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Thanks very much. The Apex is powered by Custodian, a new platform for car enthusiasts designed to help you manage your car from anywhere. Using the latest technology, it takes the pain out of ownership and lets you just enjoy the drive, because Custodian will take care of the rest. So if you believe life starts after 6,000 RPM, you need to be on Custodian. Join us now at www.custodian.club to sign up for early access and get ready to enjoy your car like never before.